The first time Jack said to me, "Mom, I'm losing my horses," I was completely confused. It took me several minutes to realize that he was responding to my request for him to be patient when I would tell him to hold your horses. Now, I'm not really sure if that's a saying out here in California, but it's one that's really common with my Midwestern family. Just wait a minute, hold your horses. Now, of course, young children don't understand metaphor at all. Like, their brains are just incapable of processing what a metaphor is. So Jack was taking that saying quite literally. I have no idea what Jack thought horses meant in that context, but he knew he was losing those horses. Yesterday he told me, "Mom, I'm just letting all the horses go." And I was like, oh no, this is not good. Now, while metaphors are completely unhelpful to young children, metaphors are essential to understand who and what God is, because we can only really describe God through metaphor and approximation. Those metaphors and images are incredibly important. They tell us not only something about God, but about our relationship to God. Some images of God have dominated our collective imagination about who and what God is. For instance, there's the stereotypical image of an old, white, bearded man in the sky. For so long, the church has called God Father and has pictured heaven as being somewhere up in the clouds. That this is, for many, the default image of God, like a stern version of Santa Claus dressed in a white robe. But the Bible gives us plenty of other metaphors and images for God. There's the image of a rock and the metaphor of a shepherd. One of my favorite images for God that I'm sure you've heard me say before comes up right at the beginning of Genesis in the first creation story. It's the image of the Holy Spirit. The passage says, "The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water." And that word hovering means brooding. Like a mother hen brooding over her chicks, the Spirit was nesting, warming the earth, preparing it to be born, worrying over it like a concerned mother. Then there's images of God in the Exodus story that are completely different. God as a pillar of cloud and God as a pillar of fire, leading the way through the wilderness. Later in the Bible, in Job, God appears out of the whirlwind, and yet to Elijah, God comes as a gentle whisper. There's all sorts of images of God, God in human form, God in nature, all kinds of ways to think about God and God's interactions with us. Now, our religious metaphors can be wonderful and insightful, opening new ways to seeing God, ourselves, and the world. But our metaphors can also be dangerous. When they are stagnant, they can limit our imagination and understanding so that we only see God as an old man in the sky. Dogmatically sticking to just a few metaphors may lead us to believe we have grasped and understood God, when in reality, God is mysterious, indescribable, and beyond our understanding. This story from Genesis about Jacob wrestling the stranger invites us to think about God, and in particular, the ways that we interact with God in a new way, with a new metaphor. It can also give us a new way to think about life and the challenges that we face. So leading up to our passage today, to give a little context, Jacob has faced a lot of obstacles in his life, despite being blessed by God. Jacob was the second-born twin who grasped after his brother from birth. In their contentious relationship, he tricks his brother Esau and gets his brother's inheritance. And then he tricks his father and he gets his brother's blessing, the better blessing because it was reserved for the elder son. When Esau finds out that Jacob has stolen his blessing on top of his inheritance, Jacob has to run away from his family because Esau threatens to kill him. Jacob goes to live with some other family, and Laban is the head of that family. And Laban agrees to let Jacob work for 7 years to marry his daughter Rachel. But he tricks him, and Jacob ends up marrying Laban's other daughter, Leah, instead. So Jacob must work another 7 years before he can marry Rachel. And then there's more trickery and trouble. This is a very long story. As Jacob bargains with Laban over his share of the household's wealth. And Jacob has to run away again. Trouble is following him everywhere. After some more conflict, Laban and Jacob finally make a peace covenant. But now Jacob is returning to his homeland, and he is terrified. Terrified that his brother Esau will still be mad at him after more than 14 years of being away. Jacob sends a gift to Esau and prays that his brother won't slaughter him and his entire household. He's so nervous about seeing his brother again that he moves his wives and children across the river so that he is alone. This is where our story takes place. After years of hard work and years of difficult relationships with his family, as if those struggles aren't enough, Jacob encounters a stranger in the night that wrestles him. The stranger turns out to be God. And here's where we get back to those metaphors. Wrestling with God. The word wrestle is only used in this passage. It does not occur anywhere else in the entire Old Testament, that Hebrew word. It's different than fighting because there are other words that mean fighting in the Hebrew. So this passage got me thinking about the difference between fighting and wrestling. We have metaphors in our culture about both fighting and wrestling. We fight illnesses, whether we're fighting a cold or cancer. We fight our way up the ladder of success. We fight our way to the top. We fight for what's right. We fight for what we want in life. Now, our church also has messages about fighting, maybe fewer in the UCC than in other denominations. In the Lutheran tradition I come from, we love that famous Martin Luther hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And it basically describes Christian life as a cosmic battle between God and the devil. And we are fighting on God's side. Or maybe God is fighting on our side. It's a little hard to tell from the lyrics. And then there's this children's song that I grew up singing, and it's, in retrospect, really disturbing to me now, and its imagery. It went like this. I may never march in the infantry, ride in the cavalry, shoot the artillery. I may never fly over the enemy, but I'm in the Lord's army. Yes, sir. It had motions and everything. It was very involved. We loved it as kids. I didn't ever really get the full message of fighting and war. But it's the same underlying metaphor as Luther's song. Life is a battle, a war, and that we are fighting on God's side. Now, I'm not saying this is universally a bad metaphor. It can be incredibly powerful, but it can also be dangerous when it defines our side as good and everyone else's side as bad. When we claim God is exclusively on our side, while the devil or evil is on the other. There's a different way we use the metaphor of wrestling in our language. We wrestle with challenges. We wrestle with the reality of death. We wrestle decisions. Sometimes we even wrestle ourselves. We use the word wrestle when we are talking about challenging ideas, concepts, and realities. Unlike fighting, when we wrestle, we don't mean to defeat, but rather to come to the best possible outcome. For example, when we wrestle with the reality of death, we don't think we'll actually be able to defeat death, but rather to come to terms with it, to see it in a more positive light. When we wrestle with decisions, we aren't trying to conquer the decision, but to come to the best possible outcome. We see in this passage, Jacob is not trying to annihilate the other man, but rather he attempts to get the best possible result, to get a blessing from him. Now, I'm not a sports expert. I think that should be clear by now. But in my understanding, wrestling is not about hurting your opponent. Wrestling is about pinning someone to the ground. Prevailing in wrestling is different than in fighting. It's not knocking someone's lights out or boxing their ears in or giving them a black eye or drawing blood. Wrestling is a test of strength, skill, technique, and endurance. Fighting as a metaphor often frames the problem as good versus bad, us versus them, where one person or thing must be destroyed for the other to succeed. On the other hand, wrestling as a metaphor does not require destruction. It's not about one side being good and the other bad. Wrestling mires itself in the complexities of life, where good and bad could be found on both sides, where the outcome may not be so clear-cut, even if you do pin the other down. Jacob walks away from the wrestling match with a blessing and a limp. When we wrestle with God, we may walk away blessed, but we may also incur some injury or change in the process. I love that this story opens for us the possibility of wrestling with God. Christianity, I think, has overused the metaphor of fighting and sometimes taken the metaphor literally, making it very dangerous. But there are plenty of times in life when wrestling may be a more apt metaphor, maybe even wrestling with God. We don't need to always be seeking to destroy our opponent, because the opponent might even be God. Even if God is the opponent, though, we can get injured in the match. Walking with God is not easy. Seeking God is not easy. Even if we are blessed by God as Jacob is, we will still face plenty of struggles. Jacob faced numerous struggles, including this wrestling match with God, through which God's people are named, the Israelites, those who strive with God. This is their blessing, Jacob's blessing. Rather than framing the world in cut and dry, good versus bad, in a fighting metaphor, we can hear in this story a call to mire ourselves in the gray areas, where we can wrestle blessings out of the messy interactions of life. We can take on a challenge for the goodness we might get out of the grappling, not in order to defeat it. We can wrestle through challenging relationships, through disappointments, and through the obstacles life throws at us. Seeing God in each other, or at least looking for God in each other. We cannot so easily label who is good and who is bad. We cannot fight to seek our own gain at another's loss. If we go about life looking for God's blessing, we cannot, oh wait, I lost my place. If we go about life looking for God's blessing, we may find it difficult to delineate sides so that we can fight. But perhaps we'll be able to see God in each other and in the world if we reimagine the fights in our lives as wrestling matches with blessings just waiting to be had. Amen.